Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Future of Privacy Forum event called The Benefits and Risks of De-Identification. And we struggled over the title because there certainly are benefits and there certainly are risks. And I think we'll be hearing on various panels both about some of the benefits, the value of data, why people are going through all the trouble to collect and log and maintain this data, and the risks that are created, but also the efforts that are that folks are going through to try to make sure that that data has the appropriate protections. When we started talking about this, there were people who said, well, don't mix up this health stuff where there's, you know, law and there are protections and then all the marketing stuff because, you know, I'm trying to cure cancer and you're talking about, you know, cookies, and these things are just worlds apart. And I think our view was that certainly there are a range of uses for data, and depending on where you sit, there are really intrinsic to the world future uses, and then there are uses that are perhaps useful and debated by others. And I think what we hope to accomplish today is to take a look at that big picture, because the worlds are converging, the lines are blurring, and some of the challenges in some area perhaps should be met with certain solutions. The challenges in the other area perhaps need different kinds of solutions, and I think we hope to not necessarily solve any things, but try to shape and put this debate in perspective. We're very lucky to kick off today with somebody who many of you know very well, Professor Peter Swire. I don't need to recite all of his history, because if you don't know him, you probably don't belong here. This is a room of folks that have been working privacy for a long time. Peter, as you know, was the first counselor for privacy in the Clinton administration, recently did a stint in the Obama administration, spends most of his day out at Ohio State. You may not know that he is going to be spending a chunk of his time this year working with the Future of Privacy Forum. We have a project in particular that he is leading with us as one of our affiliated scholars, encryption and lawful access. We'll talk about that perhaps at a later time, as well as perhaps some work that may come out of this if we light on any interesting ideas for how we might advance this paradigm. So without any further ado, let me introduce our lead-off speaker here, Professor Peter Swire. Thanks, Peter.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all awake, have your coffee, and haven't been shopping too much all weekend, so we can focus on today. So we can see this. So I was asked by Jules to try to set the stage, how de-identification came into U.S. law and why the debate matters today. We have an amazing range of experts in the room for the panel for today, and this is more a 20-minute or so attempt to try to get going on the subject. The overview is I'm going to take you through a history. We've actually had these issues in the U.S. government for over a century in the census, federal agencies do statistics, HIPAA we'll talk about. And there's some particular reasons why DID, de-identification, matters today. And there's a big debate brewing between people who says it works and others who say it doesn't. There's very strong claims out there. In my talk today, I'm going to talk about 3 different threat models, situations where different kinds of attacks can happen with different consequences. And I'm going to introduce an analogy to this being like the cops. When the police are trying to find somebody, sometimes they find them, sometimes they don't. And I'm going to suggest that's a useful mental model for what we're talking about. The big picture, I think, is that this is useful for many tasks to do masking of data, even with the limits shown by the scientists. So on the census part, the census has been collecting data, individually identifiable data, since the first census in 1790. It's highly useful data. There's a very long legal and practical tradition of using de-identification. Partly that's because periodically people get freaked out about the census. They get nervous that the government's coming to their houses and asking questions about what happens in the house. And so there's been a very strong and long-running need to have confidentiality promises when you give your every decade census information. The census for years, and there's a guy named Gerald Gates who's been a leader at the census for many years on these issues, suppresses small cell size. If there's only one house in a census tract, they don't give details on the household size. They just don't tell you what happens in that census tract for households. They fuzz data in various ways to try to remove identifying information. And there's a very set of strict rules that says they cannot re-identify. They're not supposed to release it even for national security purposes, strict transfer rules. That's the census. The census is part of a much, much broader set of experiences in the federal government where agencies do statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, lots of health statistics. And the rules around this were codified in this beautifully named SIPSIA in 2002, the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act. We have law on this subject that in many ways codified what we've been doing in the federal agencies for years. Here's the basic rule, which I think we can remember as common sense. If we collect data for statistical purposes, we're trying to get statistics here, we use it for statistical purposes, and we don't re-identify it. That's the way the federal agencies have done their massive amounts of statistics for decades. That's the basic rule. And there's a funny thing. If you go to Gallup polls and market research in the private sector, that's the same rule, right? You do the polling, people call you at home or they do a poll in some sense, they identify you, they had your phone number, but they keep it and collect it and work on it in an aggregated statistical basis. And so we see many, many years of practice with this kind of problem, and I suggest that's perhaps a basic guideline going forward. At least when you're doing statistics, use it for statistics. Don't re-identify it. It's collected under a set of promises and do it that way. Okay. Now, HIPAA is a place where the debate on de-identification heated up in the United States. There was the proposed rule in '99 that I was working on, and 2000 final rule, and it was very informed by the research of Professor LaTanya Sweeney, who's on the next panel and who's really been the pioneer in this field of re-identification. So folks in the government knew about problems with de-identification at the time of the HIPAA rule. With that knowledge, there were three paths allowed for doing things with data in HIPAA. The first is the de-identification safe harbor. If we delete lots and lots of fields, 18 or so fields, it counts as de-identified. It's scrubbed enough, it goes public. There's a second route, which I thought was important to have in the rule, which is not technologically determined in advance. So that's where you have an expert who has a statistical basis for saying that the risk of de-identification is manageable. Now we have an expert in statistics and the re-identification literature and all the attacks and all the defenses. If they say this is okay, you comply with HIPAA. And so as facts and science evolve, you can evolve on this expert basis for de-identification. The third thing that HIPAA shows, which is widely used in research for many things, is what is called data use agreements. I'm going to release this data to you and your research team for research. But there's a promise you make. You're not going to re-identify it and you're not going to leak it. This is inside administrative controls, contractual controls. It allows you to do the research, but you're not supposed to put it on the internet. You're not supposed to say who the people were. So to summarize on HIPAA, which is a very large part of the de-identification history in the US, if it's scrubbed enough, you can release it publicly. If it's scrubbed less, then you make an enforceable promise you're not going to re-ID it. That's the HIPAA structure. That's at least one big place where this has been debated over time. So why is this mattering today? Why is the room full and there's people outside who couldn't get into those precious seats you're in? I think it matters today because we're all data miners now, or at least we all can be. The internet went commercial in 1993, but the internet gives me access to amazing data just sitting at home. And my laptop's really powerful. The storage and processing on it is bigger than a mainframe was 25 years ago. Plus, we have this very cool thing some of you have used. It's called search, right? Google was founded in 1999. We didn't always have search, anything like we have today. So if you have access to all the data, a mainframe on your desktop, and awesome search, that means we get the erosion of practical obscurity. They really might figure out who we are. There's the ability to crunch numbers, and it's pervasively out there from many to many. So that's why our issue is happening today. All of these things have really heated up in the last 10, 15 years. And so what's to come of that? So the academics have gotten into the debate. We have very conflicting views on the usefulness of de-identification. Paul Ohm at the University of Colorado Law School and others emphasize some of the findings of LaTanya Sweeney and other researchers. They say if you de-identify it, the next chapter is they re-identify it. Basically, de-identification is broken. Professor Jane Iacowicz will be here later this afternoon, and others say, oh, that's exaggerated. The benefits of public data are really, really enormous. We get a lot of good things from public data, transparency, and the rest. The practical risk or harm from this re-identification is quite low when you look at it, and so we should really err on the side of de-identifying and publishing stuff. Well, that summarizes it. Anonymization either creates huge risks or low risks, and we're trying to figure out, is it worth trying to do this at all? And that's what this conference for the whole day is trying to figure out. What I'm going to suggest is that which attackers you have in mind will help you think about when anonymization helps. So I'm going to talk about three different types of attackers. One kind of attacker is the insiders who peep, the employees. Another kind of attacker are hackers who break into a database. And the third one is the public who never touches the database but can somehow find out the names in it. De-identification, I'm going to say, is often effective or a useful tool to stop the first two. So it might be worth masking to stop the first two kinds of attacks. And then the debate between Professors Ohm and Yakowitz are mostly about the third. Okay, what about peeping? What about those employees looking? I wrote an article on this a couple of years ago, which you can go read. It's got nice pictures in it and stuff. And the threat here is that you have an employee in your company. Or even more to the point, you subcontract and subcontract and subcontract out, and they have an employee, and they're looking through the data, and they see a picture of George Clooney, who just got smashed on a motorcycle accident with his girlfriend that the tabloids don't know is his girlfriend yet. This is real stuff. This happened to George Clooney. Well, it's pretty cool if all the nurses and all the data clerks and all that can see all the things about that celebrity, a political figure, a celebrity, whatever. The employee might also look about their friends, about their families, maybe especially about their ex. They can go and get information to create harm. They can get ID theft kinds of stuff. They can get blackmail. Insiders are a huge source of risk, but you can mask things from insiders. Not for all jobs, not for customer service when they're on the phone, but the data in the database can be masked so it doesn't say, this is George Clooney, really cool, look here, right? You can do things that mask that. And that way the employee doesn't stumble upon the Clooney stuff. The employee might lack the tools, even if they get into the database, to do the LaTanya Sweeney type analysis. We can have audit logs that shows what is actually being done by the employees, so they're scared to do the stuff they're not supposed to do. And we can give access to them in statistical form, and then we've really reduced the risk. Masking in all of these ways inside the organization reduces the risk that people are going to be re-identified. Similar story for hackers. Hackers might just get in for a short while. They get in, but they have to leave soon. If they get in briefly, they might not have time to see the cool stuff in my example of George Clooney. But the hackers may also download the whole database. They might have root access. They might get the whole thing. In that case, the hacker's really like somebody in the public. They may or may not be good at the Sweeney-type tricks at re-identifying. They may or may not be focused on that stuff. They might be in there for other reasons. They're looking for nuclear secrets. They really don't want to know the medical records. So they may or may not be a risk. The point here is that less than perfect de-identification, pretty good masking, if you want to call it that, might reduce the risk from hackers and from insiders. But what about the debate that people think is the debate, when the public can re-identify? Stuff's on the internet. And we've said masking might help against those other threats, but once stuff is on the internet, how depressed should we be? Can everything be re-identified? So this is the concern. Maybe it's just so easy to crunch the numbers that this exercise is futile. Masking doesn't work. So there's two famous studies. They're importantly true and importantly limited, is what I'm going to propose. So the first study, set of studies, the most famous one is, let's say I have date of birth for a bunch of people, I have their zip code, I have their gender. Just with that, I can get very high numbers, 80 or 90% uniquely identified. Oh my gosh, that seems so amazing, and so it makes us worry that public records are always going to reveal identity. It is an amazing and important finding. It helped to push the field to make us realize this stuff might not be safe. But here's my but. Date of birth is uniquely identifying. Any time in any of these studies you see date of birth, put 3 asterisks next to it. And here's why. If we have a gender field, it splits us into approximately 2 genders, right? There's some edge cases, but basically, male or female. If we have date of birth, there's 366 different birthdays in the year. Today's December 5th, tomorrow's December 6th. And you have an 80-year roughly spread. So you take 80 times 366, birth dates split the population into over 25,000 cells. If I just have date of birth, I have 25,000 buckets of people. In a population of 25,000, it's not surprising, or 50,000 or 100,000, it's not surprising I've really, really, really reduced the overlap. The masking gets stripped away because I've got a 25,000 way to chop it up. Date of birth gets huge asterisks next to it. It's what some of the earliest, strongest results were, but it's different from the other data fields like race or age or something like that, year age. So the moral is date of birth is ridiculously strong, so just realize that when you realize what re-identification does. Another study is there was a study, people could figure out Netflix, your anonymous reviews, at a very high rate, a very cool finding. But it turned out it was because they had another public database of movie reviews on the internet through IMDb. So if you do you know, all the reviews over here, and the same people are doing all the reviews over there, turns out we can match them up because they're really, really similar. We already have 90x% of the information about movie reviews, so we can find out a little bit more. The Netflix and the date of birth are some of the most famous studies. They really show re-identification, but they're not nearly as general as they seem. Oh my gosh, did I not have my, oh, yeah. I wasn't moving my slides forward. I just showed all that. I'm sorry. I gave you my really good numbers that should have made sense. Where am I? I'm sorry. There. Was this slide up at all when I was talking? Oh, this is the cool slide where you need to read it. Oh, wow. I'm going to do the really short version. Okay, I don't have this matching this. So what I was just saying about date of birth, 366 times 80. I think the point is date of birth splits everything separately. And then the Netflix, the point there is you already know most of the stuff because you know IMDb. So we have strong versions of de-identification, but limited in how generalizable they are. Okay, here's my analogy. Here's a suggestion of how to keep the complexity stuff simple in your head for today. I haven't tried this out before with anyone, but we'll see if it works. So now, for today, we're confused. Is it pretty easy to re-identify? Is it pretty hard? Is it useful to de-identify? Is it pretty much useless? I'm going to propose that you think of yourself as a cop. Welcome to the members of the police force. And you're trying to figure out who the suspect is. You're trying to identify that individual. Highly important thing for cops to do. And you have some clues. The clues in the example here is a male who's tall with red hair. Pretty identifying, you know, so that's the kind of demographic stuff you often get. Is that enough to know who the suspect is? Usually no. You've got some clues. Is it helpful? Yeah. I've just excluded a lot of the people in this room. I don't know, do we have any tall red-haired men in the room? Anybody? Some say used to be red-haired, not so much anymore, but okay. Okay, so it would basically exclude you. You guys are all safe and you can go home. So it's highly useful for excluding, not that great for finding the one person in the city that matches. And finding a male tall red hair is going to be a matter of how much legwork we do, how much extra analysis, how much extra data, how much interviewing. With enough effort, time, and money, enough cops on the street, we can probably, you know, narrow it down. But just having some clues doesn't tell us enough. There's a very big range of difficulty in how hard the suspect is. So if we said a woman between 5 foot and 5'6" with brown hair, we got a lot of those in the room. Okay, that's not going to help us nearly as much. So does de-identification matter? Yeah. It helps a lot in fuzzing up the data, but if we try hard enough, we can interview every woman who's between 5 and 5'6" with brown hair. It's hard, but not impossible. How much work we put into it is familiar to us from all the cop shows. You can find folks, usually. It takes a lot of work, and lots of times they don't bother because it's just too much work. So my last slide. This issue matters today. There's more data than we've ever had before, and it's up on the internet for the public to see. We have some history to draw on. Often in Washington, you want to realize if people have done it for decades, maybe they have a good idea. We've done this for decades. For all the statistical stuff, if we collect it that way, we use it that way, we store it that way, and we don't re-identify, and we make contracts that say that. That's SIPSIA, that's good practice in the federal government, often done for private statistics. De-identification, I said, will help us against a lot of insider and outsider hacker threats. That's useful to know. Those are stopping the insider attacks by itself is worth doing. De-identification by the public varies widely in the effort of how much it takes to find the suspect. It's hard to be a cop. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't. So our conference today is to help policymakers learn where this is going to be most useful. I hope I've at least introduced some of the dimensions of all this, and we'll look forward to the rest of the day. Thanks. And Jules is coming up? Yes, Jules is coming up. Peter, are you going to take a question or two? I'm delighted to take a question or two. Jules has given. Any question? Yes, please.
Instead of using the word legwork, what if you use the word programming? And you consider how easy it is to get thousands of computers working through robots. It's not that hard to de-identify.
Okay, so the question is, it's not legwork, it's just do some software programming and you find lots of stuff. And I think the answer to that is sometimes you can find the other data out there because there's going to be enough to identify the person. Sometimes all you've got is tall male and red hair and the city of Washington, D.C. Now, if that's all you got, you might narrow down to 1,000 people in D.C. But then you're probably going to have to go not from database, but to interviews and other traditional COP things to narrow down from the 1,000. There's not some database out there that says this is the magic red-haired tall guy. So the data may or may not exist out there. And that's the point I'm saying. I will say, sometimes the data is out there and you just match 6 more databases and you got the answer. But in my example, just like for the COP, a lot of times that's not true. You've got a bucket of people. Yeah. Okay, so this is great. We're going to do theory of like how cops operate. I invited this. The question is, what about motive? This also means if you're just sitting there at your desk with all the red-haired tall guys, if all you have is the desk, you're going to be able to sometimes narrow it down and sometimes not. Now, what you do next is you can say, well, who would have a motive to do this particular crime? And then that's what I'm calling legwork. You have to do extra stuff, right? If you're the FBI and they need this guy, they can send a lot of folks out with a lot of effort and probably narrow in pretty quickly. But if it's just sitting at your desk, you don't have enough. Motive is one of the tricks cops use to narrow it down and follow up. But the re-identification debate usually is, I'm sitting at my computer, I don't do an extra motion in the world. Can I figure out who it is? And my point is, often you have to do extra work. If you do the extra work, you can crack it, but it takes some amount of extra work often to do that.
Peter, let me ask you this. What if the work that's being done isn't necessarily technical, but the argument is, yeah, this is theoretically identifiable because I've got a lot of information, but I've said that I only use non-personal information. So I didn't de-identify, but I just never identified. How does that fit into this debate, do you think?
Well, I feel like the history for the federal statistical agencies is useful, and it's not a history so many people have spent time with. And so we have decades of practice of a sort of code of ethics that if I gathered it for statistical purposes or de-identified purposes, that it's used for that, and that we're breaking an ethical code or a contractual term or something if we then find out the name and find out it was Jules. If we did that, if we just did what Gallup's been doing or if we just did what the federal agents have been doing, a whole lot of the fuss here would not be so bad because we just say it was gathered in this bucket, it stays in that bucket, we don't re-identify, we don't need a big fuss. And I think decades of practice is useful to notice because it makes us think it's more likely to be correct and it's something the statistics people have fought over for years. I cited an article by Sylvester and Laura here that that's a pretty unique pair of names and a title, so you can find it online easily. And they go through the history, and it's a history that I think could be emulated a lot more broadly in the private sector too.